Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jamie Locke, and I serve as the Chief of Staff for the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, or what we call WHIAANHPI. Last year, WHIAANHPI was proud to launch Demystifying Federal Grants, a webinar series developed with our partners at the National Science Foundation and the Asian American Foundation to help community-based organizations prepare for and apply to federal grants and funding opportunities. Building on the Biden-Harris administration's efforts to bolster technical assistance outreach to underserved communities, today's webinar is focused on demystifying the federal grants review process. Under the Biden-Harris administration, we are working to improve the equitable allocation of federal resources, including contracts, grants, and awards, and to eliminate institutional policies or barriers within federal programs and services, which may burden our communities. One of the biggest unknowns for many applicants is what happens after their grant application is submitted. What goes on in a review? What are the steps of the evaluation process, and what factors influence funding decisions? I'm grateful for our co-hosts at the National Science Foundation and TAAF, and to all the speakers joining us today to help answer those questions. We hope that you leave us more knowledgeable and that you are better equipped to compete for federal funding. With that, I'd like to pass the floor to Sam Hyun, Director of Government Relations at the Asian American Foundation.
Thank you, Jamie. Just wanted to, really just thank the entire staff at WHIAANHPI and all of our partners and the folks who have joined us today for taking the time to really spread this information that is incredibly important. One of the main reasons why TAAF was started was because of the lack of funding that was going to the AANHPI community. And we felt as though that there was a need to fill that void and make sure that our community is receiving the same amount of resource and opportunities as everybody else. That is a huge factor as to why we've been running this program for as long as we have, and because we want to demystify in order for folks to get comfortable and know that not only are we supposed to, but we deserve to receive the same funding that everybody else does. And so over at TAAF, we're trying to do everything that we can to create the foundation to uplift as many organizations and community members as possible. We're extremely grateful to the folks who have worked so hard to make this possible, and really, really excited to continue to build with all the folks who are here. And please reach out to TAAF for any and all help that you may need, and as we look to try to serve our community the best that we can. With that being said, back to you, Jamie.
Thanks so much, Sam. Before I turn to our panelists to introduce themselves, I want to point out that our panelists are not able to give feedback on specific notice of funding opportunities, NOFOs, or applicants or applications. For those very specific program questions, please be sure to direct them to the point of contacts listed in the specific NOFO you are looking into. So first, I'm very excited to turn to our first panelist, Dr. Cherise Harris from HHS's Health Resources and Services Administration. Cherise?
Thank you, Jamie. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, to everyone. I am Cherise Harris. I'm the Director of the Division of Independent Review in HRSA. And I'll turn it over, I think, then to our next panelist, which is Max.
Thank you, Cherise. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm Max Nenswicki, and I am a visiting scholar at Clark University's Department of Social Justice and Sustainability, and also with their Integration and Belonging Hub. I've got a long history of working with AANHPI organizations, including the Asian American Pacific Islander Health Forum, CRAC, Asian American Justice Center, and others. And I've done a lot of proposal review for the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, within Department of Health and Human Services. And so I'll just preface everything else I'll say today by saying that my experience is specific to ORR and also to my experience as a grant seeker from other funding agencies. Thank you.
Thank you both. You can tell we have such a rich diversity of experiences and perspectives that folks are going to share with you today. So to get us started, Charisse, I would love for you just to share a brief overview of the general federal grants applications review process from where you are.
Okay, sounds good. So where I sit is in the Division of Independent Review, and we mostly settle with the review of the applications, which I'm sure everyone wants to know on the call. How does that go? So before we receive those applications, actually a NOFO is posted. And so as Jamie mentioned, that's a notice of funding opportunity, and basically it's the rule book. It's the playbook for what you should follow as a potential applicant and as a potential awardee. It lays out all of the legislative and statutory requirements, and you really should read it from cover to cover, start to finish. I would say at least 3 times is the rule of thumb to make sure that you understand everything that's required in that NOFO. And if you don't, ask questions. That will be one of the main things. If you take nothing else from today, always remember to ask questions. There are folks that are listed as contact in those NOFOs, and you should reach out to them once you've read that NOFO from cover to cover, and be sure to participate in that TA call. The date and time is usually always listed in the NOFO, and be sure to participate in that. A NOFO is usually on the street, is what we call it, the application window for 60 to 90 days. That is the standard. Now, what determines that depends on timing, right? There's really no rule of thumb to that. It really just depends on timing and when we're able to post. This year's a little different because of some budgetary issues. So you might see more NOFOs from HRSA only being on for 60 days instead of 90 days. But usually it's 60 to 90 days. And in that window, you're free to ask questions, attend TA calls, gather all of your information, put your application together, and be sure to post before the deadline. Cannot say that enough. Usually we have our application due dates at 11:59 on that particular date. So I would always say post early. If you can avoid posting on the day, I would say post a day before it's due, because you may have technical issues and you may need to reach out for assistance. So my rule of thumb is apply the day before. So if anything happens, you still are within time to apply. And once you apply, we take over. So that's where my shop comes in. We receive all of the eligible applications. We set up panels, which are called ORCs, which is the Objective Review Committee. They're a panelist of SMEs, or subject matter experts, that participate, and they evaluate all the eligible applications. And usually there's about 6 to 9 folks on the panel, depending on how many applications we have total. And those ORCs can last between 1 day to 3 days traditionally. And at the end of those conversations, they come up with summary statements, which are your litany of strengths, merits, and weaknesses for your application, as well as your overall score. And we take that information and we compile what is called a rank order list. And that's what's usually used for funding decisions. And then after that, you're notified as to whether or not you're part of the pool of recipients, or if you're one of the folks that just receives your summary statement, and we hope you take that feedback and use it for the next time. So all in all, the whole process about, I would say 3 to 4 months is what you're looking at from start to finish. Yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
That is. Thank you for kind of sharing from beginning to end what it might look like from the outside. So can I press on you to share a little bit more, like what, if someone were interested in being a reviewer, what are usually the typical roles and responsibilities sitting on that side?
Okay, so I don't know if Andrew has the little slides that I have, but if you do, please do share. If not, I'll just keep talking, no worries. Thank you. If we could go to the next slide. Thank you. So the ORC review participants, roles and responsibilities. So we have a few folks that are standard folks on the panel. The first is the chairperson. They're a very integral part of that ORC. They're the meeting facilitator, and their expertise is at the same level of a reviewer. And then, of course, we have our review participants. You see our little squares there. They represent all of our wonderful folks that participate in our ORCs, as well as HRSA staff. We have our program person, our grants management specialist, and my staff, which are the review administrators. And then we also have our logistics contractor support that is on the call that helps us with developing that summary statement and also monitoring the process. So if we can go to the next slide. Understanding your role. So the role of a reviewer is to fairly, equitably, and objectively review and evaluate each application, documenting strengths, weaknesses, and I will add to that METs as well. The reviewer is vital. Of course, they're the bread and butter of the ORC. They evaluate independently at home first, prior to joining the ORC panel. So they have an opportunity to go, thoroughly through those applications and compare what's in the application to the NOFO's requirements and, comment individually as far as what they see and maybe what is deficient in that particular application. And then again, the role of the chair. I just want to emphasize that again. The chair is qualified on the level of a reviewer. A chair has to have been a reviewer for a number of years before they're considered to be a chair, and they go through what we call our chair mentoring program. And so in that chair mentoring program, they learn more about their role and how to be an effective chair in the ORC. Okay, so hopefully that helps as well.
That does. Well, I'd like to get the perspective of an actual grant reviewer. So Max, I'd love to turn to you to draw on your experience sitting in that seat and some tidbits of the process you can share with us.
Absolutely. So I'll try not to repeat too much of what Charisse has just described, but some of it is more particular to my experience as a grant reviewer. And so I'll just comment a little bit more on what peer reviewers do in my experience. So as Charisse said, they review eligible applications against the published evaluation criteria that are in those NOFOs that she mentioned, the RFPs, the request for proposals. And I want to mention that in my experience, it's important for reviewers to focus on the little nitty-gritty details and also on the bigger picture. And so if you've looked, and I hope you will look at some of these NOFOs, you'll see that there are very, very specific questions and requirements and instructions for filling out the application. And so a peer reviewer will look to see to what extent the application reflects all of those requirements that are in the NOFO. So it's very important to pay attention to that. At the same time, the peer reviewer doesn't just look at the little nitty-gritty details. They don't just look at the trees. They also try to see the whole forest. And so they try to get a more comprehensive view of what the proposal is saying and how that proposal is fitting with what the NOFO is saying the federal government will fund in this case. And so, for example, they'll be looking at things like, is this proposed project in keeping with the broad intent of the NOFO? They'll be looking at, do the plans that are proposed in this application make logical sense? They'll be looking at, does every part of this proposal relate to every other part in a sensible way? Like, does the evaluation plan fit with the plan for implementing the project? And does that fit with the budget? Does that fit with every other part? You need that cohesiveness. And also, they'll look at what might be missing from the proposal. So, for example, if you're saying in your proposal that you want to focus a project on recent immigrants from a country where English is not the first language spoken, and you don't talk about language access, well, that is something that a peer reviewer should know, that you really, in order to serve this community, you need to have certain pieces in place. And so that's the first thing that the peer reviewers are responsible for doing. Then also they after they have read the proposals, They'll input their initial scores and comments. In the case of ORR, Office of Refugee Resettlement, they use a secure online portal. And then they'll get together with their committees and they'll discuss their initial scores and their initial comments, and they'll learn from one another. They'll listen closely to one another, and they might change their minds. They might learn from that experience that they missed something when reading the proposal, or that something that they hadn't considered is important really is, or they might teach others, from their own experience and knowledge. So they go through that process. Sometimes after that, they'll edit their comments or clarify their comments or their scores based upon questions from the staff of the federal agency. And then I'll also note here that peer reviewers really need to be very careful about the way they express themselves, because this is obviously very important. You're talking about the people's money being spent for we all hope the best purposes possible. And in addition to that, many of the federal agencies will provide reviewer comments to grant applicants. They'll provide those comments without identifying who the peer reviewer was, but still you want to be very diplomatic and very clear in the way that you express yourself when you're evaluating proposals. Now, I've also been asked to talk about what are the qualifications of a peer reviewer. And so reviewers should have a high level of knowledge and expertise relating to the subjects of the funding opportunity that they're asked to score on. They are often subject matter experts. They're sometimes community leaders, scholars, or they could be really from other backgrounds as well. It's important that peer reviewers be from all different communities, to have diverse peer reviewers, because we all, based upon our professional experience and our lived experience, we all have different knowledge, and we bring different perspectives to the table, which are valuable. And so, for example, if you're from a community, getting back to language access again, why not? Where language access is a challenge, then that might be more top of mind for you when you're reading a proposal and commenting on it. And it's important to have that kind of perspective in the mix for federal allocations of funding. And then as for the specific qualifications for being a peer reviewer, that will really vary depending upon the federal agency that you're talking about. And you can learn more about that by reviewing the website and the other materials of the federal agency, and really looking at these NOFOs. Like if there's a NOFO that's focused on, I don't know, like business development for recently resettled refugees, that implies a different set of knowledge and expertise than maternal and child care, for example. And so it's really a very wide variety of skills and expertise are needed among panel members. Now, I've also been asked to give a few insights into the peer review system related to training and confidentiality and conflict of interest. And so I'll just briefly say that in my experience, and I think this is standard across all the federal agencies, that there are training programs in place for peer reviewers, often in the form of live or recorded webinars, as well as written materials that you can review. And I'll also say that as a peer reviewer, it's very important, in my experience, to spend a lot of time reviewing the NOFO that you're going to be scoring on. Because you don't want to be, like, if you've seen these things, they're very extensive documents. And you, in order to do your job well, you need to have a very, very thorough knowledge of what is in that NOFO. So that's a significant investment of time, but it's actually very interesting, and gives you a really new view into the workings of federal agencies, I find. And then also you can rely on the coordinator of your panel often as sort of a guide or someone to ask questions of. Often the person in the panel who has been sort of identified as the coordinator is somebody who's had more experience with this work. And so they can be very, very helpful to you. Now, as pertains to confidentiality, I'll just say that peer reviewers need to sign and agree to not share proposals outside of their peer review group, not share the content of proposals like ideas or information from those proposals from outside of their content, their peer review group. And then also to not keep any proposal files or any of the materials that they're reviewing. And so these days, so much, just practically everything is electronic, but you really need to dispose of those, destroy those in a way that will not compromise the confidentiality of the process that you're engaging in. Having to do with conflict of interest, you'll also be asked to read and to sign an agreement that says that affirms that if you have a conflict of interest with any proposal that's put before you, you will notify the agency and you will be removed from reviewing that proposal. And so this would mean that if you work for an organization or have worked for an organization, or if you have a close family member or a friend who works for that organization, you wouldn't be reviewing the proposal that's coming in from that organization. And that makes a lot of sense. I'll also quickly say that there is compensation for peer reviewers who are not federal employees. And it's a very modest sum, actually, when you calculate the number of hours and the really the intense attention you need to dedicate to this work. And you consider that in terms of the compensation. You're not doing it for the money. You're doing it to make a contribution, and you're doing it because it's interesting and it's important work, and you learn a lot through the experience. And so should I go on to talk about what are some of the benefits of becoming a peer reviewer at this point? All right, I'll move forward with that. I think that's next in our agenda. And so, first of all, I just want to really encourage you all listening here to engage in this experience of becoming a peer reviewer. It's really, really interesting. It's a valuable experience professionally and personally, and it's a great way to contribute back to the community and back to our country. Serving as a peer reviewer gives you much better insight into the grant review process, and it improves your skills in grant seeking, as well as in program planning and in evaluation. If you're a decision maker in an organization, I want to encourage you to, among your staff and the people you work with, to do your best to identify people who you think would be good peer reviewers, and to encourage them to apply, and to make it possible for them to do that by giving them flexible time or time off if that's necessary, because again, this is a fairly significant time commitment. Let's see, I'll just list, in closing out this little section, I'll list some of the things that I've learned in being a peer reviewer. So I've learned a lot about being a grant seeker, and I'm a much stronger grant seeker and program planner and evaluator and budgeter than I was beforehand. And one of the things I learned is that you always follow the instructions in a federal grant proposal. And that means that, like, if there's a question that's asked that you don't have a good answer to, you still give an answer to that question, even if it's to say, you know, I need to learn more about this, or the data on this question aren't available from any source. You don't ignore any of the questions. You answer everything to the best of your ability, and in the format that's requested. And so normally there will be sort of a grant, suggested proposal outline for you to follow. And I very much suggest that you follow that outline. I also learned that it's important to pay attention to the details and to the big picture. Something I mentioned before about what peer reviewers will be looking for, but as a grant seeker, it's important to know that as well. You need to focus on the nitty-gritty details, and you have to focus on the big picture and really show to the peer reviewers why your proposal is a good fit for the NOFO that you're talking about. And this is where it really benefits you to like tap that visionary and inspiring part of your brain and show the excitement that you have for the work that you're doing. It's important to bring that across in the proposal as well as focusing on the little details. I've also learned that it's important to be realistic in your plans and at the same time, very optimistic. And finally, to remember that peer reviewers are processing a lot of information in a compressed period of time. And so to try to be as clear and concise as possible in the way that you are expressing yourself, and to always, again, as Cherise said, don't like work up to that final minute deadline. Try to get things in beforehand. And then in addition to that, build in time for someone else, for other people to review your work and say, for them to say, you know, this part really isn't clear to me. Can you explain that better? Or this part, I think this is kind of long and you could condense this more. You really need like more than one person's set of eyes on any good proposal to a federal agency, especially. And for there, I'll close this little section.
Okay, well, Max, that was a lot. And I have to say ditto to everything you said. Everything you said is exactly on point. It's exactly on par with how our process works at HRSA. It's nice to hear it from a reviewer's perspective, though. So it's nice to know that we're kind of seeing things the same way from different perspectives. And I guess I would just echo on the fact of when you're working on your application, if you can, don't make it a solo effort. Always have a team. That's something we recommend to folks, is to always have a team working on that application with you. As Max said, it can be daunting. It's a very, very large document that you have to go through as far as the NOFO. And then the application you're needing to put together could be up to 60 or 80 pages. And it's very easy to miss a whole section. It has happened where we've had folks reach out to us saying, mea culpa, we missed a section. What can we do? And depending on whether or not the application period has passed, there's really nothing that can be done. So definitely have a team work on it with you, and definitely, as he mentioned, have someone review it who's not part of your team, who's somebody who's going to listen to your argument and make sure that you're stating your case, right? Because we're very impassioned about our own organizations and about what we're talking about, but sometimes because we're so impassioned, we think that we're being clear and we're not as clear as we think. So it's always nice to have someone who's not a part of your team to read that application as well before you hit that submit button. But yes, spot on, Max. Everything you said, absolutely. Okay, so going back to some of the things that are part of the questions, I know Max hit on conflict of interest, which thank you. That's absolutely what we do in HRSA for conflict of interest. Something I want to add to that piece, though, is yes, you talked about if you have a relative or if you've applied yourself for the competition that you would not be able to serve on that panel, but we also have something in HRSA about geographic location that determines whether or not you have a conflict of interest. So say, for instance, you're in California and there are about 45 applications in the competition from California, which is a very real story. It happens. So what will that mean for you? It will mean that you would not be able to be on a panel with the California application because there's a perceived conflict of interest there. So understand that if you come from a large state, and if you have a lot of networks and those types of things, we'll have to find a place to put you where we don't have an application from your state on that panel. And that is for anyone. You could be from Montana, Idaho. Doesn't matter your state, just as long as you're not on a panel with an application from that state. So I just wanted to emphasize that as far as conflicts of interest. And I want to hit a little bit on the time commitment. I think that was something that we wanted to cover in this particular session as far as overall time commitment for a reviewer. And Max definitely hit on it. I just want to emphasize from our perspective, when you look at a pie chart, And if you have that PowerPoint back, that would be great. The first slide is a pie chart, and it kind of talks about the time commitment of a reviewer. And there it is. And so about 50% of your time, which is the biggest allotment, will go to your independent evaluation. Okay, so that is the meat and potatoes of what you would do as a reviewer. And that's what our reviewers are asked to do, to allocate about that much time to the actual independent evaluation of going through that NOFO and going through those applications in their entirety. And then there's about 15%. Right, of where folks have to use for submission. Now we use the ARM system, and I think Max, you all use something different. I think you mentioned it, but I missed it. I'm sorry. But our system is the ARM system that our reviewers use, and it's an electronic system where they receive the applications as well as submit their applications. And then there's what we call the pre-ORC part, which is where we, as HRSA and our contract support staff, we merge those preliminary summary statements together, and we parcel those out to all of the panels. And then of course there's ORC, which takes about 25% of the time. So as I mentioned, an ORC on average is either 1 day to 3 days. We have a few that are weeks long. We have a couple of those coming up this year. Actually, that'll be a couple of weeks long. Those are for our very large competitions, but on average, it's about 1 day to 3 days for the ORC. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Go ahead.
And Max, I first wanted to introduce myself. I'm Joyce Liu. I'm one of the consultants for TAAF. We unfortunately had some technical difficulties on moderation, so I'm hopping in. Charisse, thank you for talking about the timeline. Would it be possible for you to talk a bit about how HRSA goes through a process of selecting peer reviewers? I know each agency is slightly different. So folks on the call, please keep that in mind, that this is specifically for HRSA.
Yes, so in HRSA, we actually have a database. We have a reviewer database where we have folks apply and register to become a reviewer. There's no specific qualifications as far as will we reject you, but mostly what we're looking for is that you just have part of the expertise that we're looking for, which is usually any expertise in our major bureaus, which would be HIV/AIDS, maternal and child health, Bureau of Health Workforce, Health Systems Bureau, all those things. Thank you so much. And rural health as well as those primary areas. And then we have additional expertise, which is DEIA, lived experiences, health equity, and social determinants of health. So these are the big buckets, I would say, of what we query for all of our competitions. Now, we work in conjunction with the bureaus and offices, which is what we consider program. So the name of the individual that's in your NOFO that you reach out to for questions and is considered your program or your project officer, those are the folks that we work with to gather the expertise that are needed for each competition. We query our database, and then when we come up with our running list, we run that list by program, and we go back and forth looking at resumes, matching it to your profile and matching it to the expertise that is needed. And that's how we decide the folks that should be solicited to be on a particular panel. And of course, we hope everyone's available when we reach out. Sometimes they're not, and sometimes we have to go back to our database and run that all over again. But that's usually how the process works. It's usually a two-party process between my office and the bureaus and offices as far as selecting who's on each panel.
Thank you for that insight. A follow-up to that is, you mentioned the database that HRSA holds. So if someone applies to be a peer reviewer and have been selected, will they continue to stay in that database, and can HRSA continue to draw upon that? What if someone has applied to be a peer reviewer and was not selected? Do they reapply again?
Great question. So no, we do not deactivate you out of our database, but we always recommend that folks go in at least every 6 months and update and give us your updated resume or CV, because our programs are changing every year. So what you may have listed last year may not be as relevant the next year. So going back to what Max said, if you look at the open opportunities that are in HRSA and then seeing whether or not you have expertise that match those open opportunities, be sure to update that resume and re-upload it into our system, because we do ask that you do that at least twice a year. And so if you haven't been asked to be a reviewer, we just say reach out to us. And we'll try to look at your CV, look at your resume, see what maybe you might need to tweak in order to match what we're looking for now, because a lot of our programs run for 3 or 5 years. So if you were called 3 years ago, you know, you'd be called again for that same competition. But in the meantime, there's some other things that you might be qualified for. So just make sure you put everything in your resume that you have expertise in.
I know we have a few folks who have joined in to this call who are really interested in potentially becoming a peer reviewer. So I know this was talked a little bit about before, but Max, can you speak a bit about your experience on applying to be a peer reviewer?
Sure. Well, you know, I think applying to be a peer reviewer it's much simpler than applying for a grant, but it's you know, it's similar in some ways, which is that, you know, you find the place to apply and you follow the instructions and you express your interest and then you kind of wait. And in my experience with ORR, the process has been simple and pretty quick, I guess. But I encourage folks to go to the websites of the agencies and the offices that they're particularly interested in. And on those websites, you should be able to find ways to send your application in. It's not always exactly the same system that the agencies use, I think. If you have questions, there should be contact information there at the agency for you to address those questions to as well.
I know from experience, especially talking to the incredible folks who work in these agencies, that you're always really open to questions about this process and are always actively recruiting. So if you're interested, please go to that specific agency's website and look under their grants. And most agencies will have a specific section on how to become a peer reviewer. And if you have any questions, there's generally a contact as well that you can reach out. So that being said, we have a question from the audience, and it's something that Max, you touched a little bit upon earlier about how important it is that peer reviewers are reflective of the communities that our country serves. So can either of you talk a little bit about the efforts to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in the grant review process, and specifically, are there any efforts to recruit diverse peer reviewers? So twofold question. Charisse, would you like to go first?
I can do that. So yes, we have active efforts going on in HRSA. We actually have an agency level work group that is devoted to health equity and grants and simplifying grants to make sure that we're not excluding anyone from being able to apply to HRSA funding. That's one effort that we're doing. Also, we're participating in things like this to help to reach out to specific communities and just to kind of market and let folks know we're here and we're interested in you becoming a reviewer for us. Also, what we do in HRSA is we have a social media campaign. So if you're on X or if you're on LinkedIn, look for us. We are advertising out there for HRSA reviewers, and that's hopefully a way that we can reach different communities and different groups and get folks aware that we're here. There's some things that we're thinking about doing this year as far as partnering with some specific organizations to try to get on their platform so then their folks can know that we're here. So there's some other things that we're thinking about, but we're also trying to leverage our resources with our sister agencies like SAMHSA, ACF, IHS, those folks to kind of compare and to get their lists and be able to reach out to some different types of folks and get them registered in our database. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you. Max, do you have any input on this?
No, it's wonderful to hear about those initiatives from Charisse. I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, definitely. And like you said earlier, that when there are groups of peer reviewers who have an understanding of the communities, they also have this additional insight into knowing that things that might not traditionally be listed on a NOFO, for example, translations, cultural competency might be something that's necessary to the NOFO to be able to carry out the mission, but truly it's that additional understanding, which is why part of this is also a plea for folks on the call to apply, or folks, if you know someone within your organization who would be a great peer reviewer, to ask them to apply as well. We can always make sure that inclusivity is also part of something that we work on as well. So our next question is, Charisse, for you, how can agencies support applicants during the process of grant review, and sorry, not grant review, for applying for grants? And then can you talk a bit about how federal agencies communicate with applicants throughout the process?
Great question. So one thing that HRSA does is we have that TA call that I mentioned earlier that's listed in every single NOFO that we post. It's usually fairly early on in the process. So I would say about no later than a month out from when a NOFO posts, we'll hold a technical assistance call. And that's kind of like a 2-hour session where folks jump on who potentially want to apply and just, listen to the conversation, listen to the instructions, the tips. We do give some tips in these calls about some things to think about. And the point that Max made about data, which is a great point, thank you. That's one of the sticking points for our ORC panels, is that if you cite old data, they really don't like that. So if you can't get newer data, and when I say newer data, 5 years or less, you really need to ask that question in those TA calls about what should you do, what should you cite? Is it okay if I can only find 10-year data, say you're only using census data, for instance? There may be some caveats there that we can give you on those calls that might help you with those things, but also to his point, don't skip over anything. Answer every requirement, answer every question. And so those are some of the things that I would say to do. Yeah. And what else do we do? We also have some bureaus, though, that actually hold sessions outside of the TA call. They have what they call, I think, community calls, and that, for lack of a better term, where they will reach out specifically in certain areas and hold sessions. And it's kind of like an open session for people who might be interested in HRSA opportunities. And some of those are held in the regions. And so I would say be on the lookout for those. We have, 10 regions, I believe, that we serve in HRSA. And each region has like a HRSA center or HRSA site that may be closer to you than maybe headquarters is. So I would say go to our website, which is hrsa.gov. Go to the Office of Intergovernmental External Affairs. And no, it's a wordy word, but it's IEA. And they have all the regions listed, and you can see all of the directors that are listed for each region, and ask them and see if they're holding any sessions close to you. If you're not able to make a session at headquarters, and that can assist you as well throughout the process as far as how to apply. And we work with them. My office works with IEA as well on holding some seminars for some of those regional folks. So yeah, we try to reach out the best that we can. But if we don't reach out to you, you reach out to us. That's always my recommendation. So.
Sometimes writing the email is the hardest part. So really, how, I guess a follow-up to you, Charisse, is if someone is really nervous about reaching out, what would be, I guess, some tips that you have for, what would they exactly write in their email? Like what would be helpful, I guess, from your side? And
so the recommendation would always be to have read the NOFO before you reach out. I know I had that question before from a group about 2 weeks ago. It's like, how do you craft that email? What do you say? You don't have to have started your application before you reach out, but you do need to have read that NOFO before you reach out, and really just ask questions of whatever's in the NOFO. Let them know I read on page 6, this, and this, and I just have a question about paragraph 2. That's all you really have to do. But just have knowledge of that NOFO before you reach out to that person listed in the NOFO, because it'll help. You'll have a better guided conversation then, and it'll be targeted, and it'll help you when you write your application.
Thank you. So we have a question from the audience of if and this is going back to peer reviewers, that what if you don't consider yourself a subject matter expert? Should I still apply to be a reviewer if I maybe don't have a PhD in this topic?
I would say absolutely. Let me speak for HRSA. Yes, absolutely. You do not have to have a doctorate in anything in order to be a reviewer. There are plenty of programs where education is not a requirement. However, there are some where education is a requirement. So I want to be transparent about that, but it's not the majority of our competitions where education is a requirement. We do look at expertise, your level of experience, your lived experience, especially if you're a consumer, any of those types of populations, or maybe you're a doula, maybe you're a midwife, maybe you're a practitioner. I mean, there are a lot of areas where we look for expertise. It's not just academic in the long and short of it. So please do. But I would say to you also, look at our opportunities that we have out there, and then you can kind of get a better gauge as far as where your expertise may align with what we're looking for. But education absolutely is not always the requirement. It is not.
And I'll just add that I think, you know, a lot of people, a lot of us have the tendency to like be more critical of ourselves than other people are critical of us when it comes to our abilities. And so I want to echo what Charissa said, that I think, you know, you should apply to be a peer reviewer and give it your best shot. Say what, you know, identify your strengths, what you think your strengths are, and show those to the federal agency through that process. And then let them decide, because you really you can learn a lot about what they might be looking for in peer reviewers, but ultimately you might not know everything that they're looking for, and they might be looking for someone with exactly your set of skills and experience. And so I think just going through the application itself, it can be a valuable experience. So I really encourage people to do that.
Max, drawing upon your answer with that, can you talk a bit about the times where you drew upon your experience working with Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities, and how that's really affected how you look at certain grants when you served as a peer reviewer?
Oh gosh. Well, I spent a lot of time working in organizations that were at the national level, but were still very community-based, and that did a lot of work on community empowerment and helping people all over the United States from different backgrounds to have their voices heard. And so I think that something I brought to the panel review was a sensitivity to whether communities have been involved in identifying needs that were going to be addressed through a project, and also how those needs would be identified, and then how the programs would be evaluated. And so I was often like one of the people who was raising his hand and saying, well, you know, this makes sense, this project plan makes sense. But it seems like this was a project plan that's made by somebody who was sitting in an office and didn't have much contact with the community. Whereas the evidence here that community members were consulted in what they wanted to have addressed and how they wanted to have it addressed, and what in particular they needed support with. And so often with Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities, that had to do with language access. It had to do with, you know, just a really tremendous amount of cultural diversity and linguistic diversity. So, you know, not making sense necessarily to say we're going to, you know, provide these services to all Asians in the Seattle area without giving an acknowledgement of the diversity of that community in terms of language and culture. Yeah, so those are a few things from the top of my head.
Thank you. I think we have about time for about 2 more questions from the audience. This one is for you, Charisse. In the event an application is submitted incomplete before the closing period, Are the applicants notified of that, and would they have a chance to complete it before the deadline of a submission?
That's a great question. And I would err on more often than not, no, you are not notified. Grants.gov does have a notification that they give out to folks, kind of like an all call, saying whether or not they deem something is missing or if your submission didn't go through. So I would definitely pay attention to that. But we as an agency, no, we're not going to reach out to you in advance to let you know that something is missing. So that's why it goes back to have that group work together on that application. So you have different folks responsible for different pieces, have that come together, and also have that third person outside or fourth person outside read that application to make sure that you don't have any holes or any gaps. But it also, again, goes back to reaching out to that project officer and asking those questions to make sure. Now, when I look at that program narrative and you have the header of needs assessment and you have the header of resources, capabilities, what all do I need to include under that section? Right. But unfortunately, no. My agency, we just receive so many applications every year. I mean, our office goes through like 3,000 applications a year that no, unfortunately, we really don't have the bandwidth to reach out to you prior to the submission date. So that's why it goes back to my tip of please submit early if you can. So say you submit it 5 days before the deadline and you're going through and you realize, oh no, I forgot to upload the bio sketches, or oh no, I forgot to upload the org chart. You still have an opportunity to go back and submit a new application because we always take the latest submission. So you can in theory submit 10 times to the same announcement as long as you do it before the deadline, and we'll take your latest submission. Okay.
Thank you. And also you can sign up for email updates from the HRSA website. And a lot of agencies tend to also include upcoming NOFOs in their email announcements, and it's very helpful. So I have one closing question for each of you, starting with you, Max, is can you leave us with one final tip for applicants on understanding the grant review process? I know it's a big question.
Right. Well, okay. Well, so my one final tip is to imagine that you're someone who's walking like on a wire, those tightrope walkers with like a stick that they hold to maintain their balance, and that you need to maintain that balance between detail and big picture. So that's the image I guess I'll leave you with, and to have confidence that you'll reach the end of that wire and you'll achieve your goal of getting the grant.
That is a great metaphor. Thank you, Sharice.
It is. I don't think I can top that, Max. I don't have a great metaphor like that, but I would say that, when you're writing your application, just imagine that nobody on the panel knows anything about what you're talking about or your organization, because you really can't take for granted that reviewers will fill in the blanks and that they'll be able to fill in the gaps. They won't be able to access your website. We tell them not to go to any external websites. So if you have not written it in your application, it does not exist. So as much as there may be expertise on the panel about the subject, when you're writing your application, pretend as if they know nothing, and that you have to tell the story. You have to paint the picture. And so when you're walking that tightrope and you have that beam in your hand and you're trying to balance, always remember that the imagery that you're giving has to be backed up by explanation and evidence. So that's what I would leave with you.
Thank you, everybody. I want to express my deep appreciation to the panelists here today. Max, Sharice, you really brought us into the review room with you. So thank you again for sharing that 360 version of the grant review process. I want to thank again NSF and TAAF for their partnership to make today's series happen, as well as our previous webinars. A special shout out to those in front of the scenes, behind the scenes, to make this series happen. WHIAANHPI's communications advisor, Andrew Pang, and TAAF consultant, Joyce Liu. Please stay engaged with WHIAANHPI by following our socials and visiting our website. We also dropped into the chat here TAAF's Grants TA website that houses a lot of the resources that we talked about today. Thank you for your participation today. This concludes our webinar.